Hey, good morning, everybody. How are you all? Good morning, everybody. How are you all? In my retirement, I'm now teaching at the University of Maine at the William S. Cohen Institute, and when my students come in, not that this is a student relationship, but I always ask them how they are, and they do the same thing. Oh, no. At least they're not using the COVID excuse anymore for not showing up my class. Well, good morning. I want to welcome you to the third annual Lauren W. Craner lecture here at the home of the International Republican Institute in Washington, D.C. My name is Peter Madigan, a member of the board of IRI for over 30 years, believe it or not. I was 10 years old when I joined the board. I have the honor this morning of introducing our featured guest and the president of the IRI. And I hope you feel at home this morning here in the Ronald Reagan Conference Center. We're really pleased that you're here this morning. Before I introduce Dan Twining, our president and our guest, I'd like to say a few words about the important purpose of this lecture series. Lauren Craner was twice a past president of the International Republican Institute. He came, ran it, went into work for the Secretary of State, then Colin Powell, and then we begged him to come back and run it again. And Lauren had a long tenure here in the growth, in the ideas to really grow the vision of International Republican Institute as you see it today. He served his country as a Capitol Hill staff member for Senator John McCain and in the administrations of both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush at the highest levels. Lauren became my dear friend when he and I both served under Secretary of State James A. Baker III in the Office of Legislative Affairs. We were born in the same year and both shared a passion for the Boston Red Sox, who, by the way, at that point hadn't won a World Series, so it wasn't in fashion to be a Red Sox fan. Lauren lost a battle to cancer just 3 years ago, and many of us had the opportunity to know him and to serve with him, and I had this extreme fortune to be his close friend. We shared our professions and our families grew up together, and there wasn't a day when I wasn't happy to be in his company. He made us smarter, and he made us kinder. Today, we're joined by his family. His wife, Anne, his daughter, an IRI staff member, Isabel, his son and congressional staffer, Alexander, better known as Ricky, and all the way from Scotland, somewhere watching us via Zoom today, is Charlie from his flat at St. Andrews University in Scotland. Each wonderful people, and as you can see, carrying on the tradition of public service and devotion to our country. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the IRI, Dr. Dan Twining. Dan has carried on the tradition of intelligent leadership here at IRI. He's been doing a superb job with his team in leading and growing our organization to face challenges of the 21st century. Dan Twining started here at IRI as an intern under Lauren Craner. He's also served as the top foreign policy staff member to Senator John McCain. Do you see the common thread here yet? So when we're thinking about the best way to honor the legacy of Lauren, we looked collectively at the gifts he had. Patriotism, an unapologetic devotion to the principles this nation was founded under. Intellect, the idea that planning and critical thinking make for best foreign policy. And action. Action's the hallmark of this institute. And Lauren used to always say that IRI is not a think tank, we're a do tank. We here at IRI are in the democracy business. This is a contact sport that requires the most devoted and passionate staff. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the people and the ideas and the passion here on our staff at every level of the organization. So today it is a pleasure to introduce you to my other old friend, David McCormick. Dave is the author of a new book, Superpower in Peril. Superpower in Peril is a well-constructed and readable book. Readable is important these days, about the problems the United States faces today. He gives us a solution in the book. He doesn't just talk about the problems. He gives us ideas to ponder that require action for us to maintain our position in global affairs as a beacon of hope for democratic government that allows for freedoms, the freedoms we hold so dear. Dave is the right person to visit with us today. He's a graduate of West Point. He received his PhD from Princeton. He served in the 82nd Airborne Division as a captain and was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor in the First Gulf War. He served as Undersecretary of Commerce, Deputy Assistant to the President, and Undersecretary of the Treasury in the administrations of George W. Bush. Dave then went on to a career in business. He'd actually been in business before, so he came out of business, and finance, and most recently as CEO of the world's largest and most successful hedge fund, Bridgewater Capital. He's married, and he and his wife, Dina, have 6 daughters. That's 6 daughters. Good thing he went into finance, because that's a lot of weddings to pay for. You can laugh. Most importantly, Dave McCormick is my friend. He is, in my mind, an important voice for the future of the Reagan doctrine of foreign policy. This idea that the United States can and must remain a leader for the ideals of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. I'm heartened that he's sharing his book with us this morning. It gives us an idea of who he is, and importantly, his thinking and ideas for solutions to tough problems. I'm now pleased to introduce both Dan Twining and David McCormick to the stage.
We're going to abandon the podium in a minute, but we do want to have Dave come up just to tell you a little bit more about why he wrote this book. I'm Dan Twining, I'm president of IRI. We're so lucky to have Peter Madigan not only on our board of directors, but really as a champion of remembering and honoring our great friend Lauren Craner, great mentor and leader to so many of us. The Lauren Craner Memorial Lecture was Peter's idea to memorialize Lauren's life at IRI. We've had Bob Zellick inaugurated. We had Steve Biegun, former Deputy Secretary of State, do it last year. We're very proud to have Dave McCormick here. The quality here is at least even, if not going up. So Peter's helping us set a very high standard. But I would just like to say, before we open it up with Dave, what a big impact Lauren Craner had, not just on me, but on an entire generation of us as young people. Took us very seriously when most people didn't, and I'm not always sure he should have, but was a real pioneer in this business of supporting democracy and freedom around the world. Lauren always approached it in a very pragmatic way. He was a terrific diplomat, as all of you who knew him know. He understood the world as it was. He had deep background in Asia, so he wasn't some kind of messianic missionary for freedom. He simply understood that societies work better, produce stability, peace, prosperity, security, when people have a voice, when governments are responsive, when citizens can be heard by their leaders, when institutions work. He touched millions of people around the world through his work, so we're very proud just to honor him with the Lauren Craner Memorial Lecture. With that, let me introduce Dave McCormick up to the stage. He's going to say a few words up front, then we're going to sit down and have a chat. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's really an honor to be able to be here for the Lauren Craner annual lecture, to be with his family, so thank you for being here. And Peter, a dear friend for, I don't know, a lot of decades, and Dan, great to be with you too. So thank you all, and I want to thank you for showing up, because when you write a book, you're kind of nervous, you're vulnerable, because you're putting yourself out there for people to judge. And I've actually been through this once before. This is my second book. After the military, I got out on the GI Bill, and I went to graduate school, and I wrote a dissertation. It became a book. And this was about reforming the military. And that was a time when Amazon was actually an online bookstore. And this was 1997, and I was waiting for the book to be reviewed. So I'd check every day the internet, see what happened. Is there a review? First couple of days, no review. Finally, on the third day, there's a review. 5 stars. I got a 5-star review. Thank God, validation. And I go to the review and I start reading it, and it's just unbelievable. Dr. McCormick's a genius. The ability to dissect the problems and offer solutions. And I got to the bottom, and it said, anonymous, Lemoyne, Pennsylvania. That's where my mom lived. And this was a 5-star review from Mom. And so I was very grateful. I haven't got Mom's review on this book yet, but I'm optimistic it's going to be good. I wrote the book with my great colleague and friend, James Cunningham. James was a true intellectual partner in every way. But we came to decide to write the book a couple years ago before I decided to run for the Senate. And the reason for writing it was the belief that America was in decline. In economic terms, with $31 trillion of debt, sky-high inflation, the highest in 40 years, with really the worry that where you were born economically was where you were likely to stay. If you're born in the 4th quartile, the probability of getting to a higher quartile was less than had been the case since in the post-war period. On a national security level, we're being challenged by China. So in relative terms, we're in decline in terms of our military capability in the world. And spiritually, we're losing our way as a country with the polarization in our country, with really our institutions eroding in many ways, and the leadership to take our country forward based on fundamentals of America's exceptionalism and liberty and government conceived for the people. All these things are at risk. And I was deeply worried because the conversation is almost decline's inevitable. And decline's not inevitable. The American story, in fact, is one of decline and renewal, decline and renewal. It depends on what we do. So James and I wanted to write a what to do book, a book about renewing America, a book that would put decline in context but offer hope for the future. So the cover is very ominous because I think we're at a very ominous moment. Big red bold letters, superpower and peril, but the book's actually optimistic, and it offers a plan for how we can educate our people, confront China, secure America, and it really is based on 2 principles. One, that we need to go to the gym at home. We need to build capability at home. We've let ourselves slip. We've been sleepwalking for the last couple decades in terms of the fundamentals of what it takes to be a strong and powerful and influential country, but also how we need to engage with China and the world abroad. And as I said, it's an optimistic book because this is the American story. We get to the edge of the cliff and we pull ourselves back. And the reason I feel so confident and optimistic about that is I lived through it in the late 70s. So I was born and grew up in rural Pennsylvania. And in the late 70s, we were in a period where double-digit inflation, something like 15, 16%, economy in recession, challenged on the global stage by the Soviet Union. We had gas lines. OPEC kind of had a headlock around our economy at the time. And I remember there were odd days and even days where you would go to get gas. And I remember sitting in the gas line, I was 14, 15 at the time with my dad, in the Country Squire, which was a station wagon about a half a block long with wood on the sides, waiting for gas. And there was Desert One, where there was an attempt by Jimmy Carter to go into Iran, rescue our hostages. There was a disaster, a catastrophe on the desert sands where we lost 8 service members, which reminds me a lot of Afghanistan, where I think bad decision-making and bad leadership led to a calamitous exit from Afghanistan, which is one of the reasons that really inspired me to run. So at that time, just like today, 80% of Americans thought the country was going in the wrong direction, 1979. 1983, I was a plebe at West Point. If you've ever been to West Point, I was walking across those pathways. You're in this beautiful, in the mountains, looking out in the Hudson Valley. The economy was on fire. Inflation was in check. We were on our way in a military buildup that ultimately led to the end of the Cold War in 1989 without a shot fired. And it was Ronald Reagan running for re-election on the tagline of Morning in America. And it was. And the reason I cite that story and I talk about it in the book is that leadership matters. So you got to have a lot of great policies. So I try to outline in the book the policies for this moment. They're not the same policies. Some of them are, but not the same policies of the Reagan moment. But there's policies for this moment. But the most important thing is leadership. Leadership to take our country forward. And that's what you celebrate here. That's what IRI is all about. And so I'm so glad to have an opportunity to speak to you all and talk about the book. And thank you for having me.
Great.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for whetting our appetite. That's super. I've got a bunch of kind of policy and thinking about the future questions for you, but I would like to pick up the point on leadership. You've talked about virtuous leadership, servant leadership. I heard you in a great podcast talking about some of the principles that I think you have learned from mentors. Could I just flesh you out a little bit on what makes a great leader based on your experience? Please grab the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Well, when we started writing the book, it didn't have a clear outline to start with. It was almost a journey. And so we spent a lot of time on policies. The book was about policies to start with. Then the publisher came back and said, those are good policies. Nobody's going to read that. Nobody's going to read that. So you got to introduce some more of your personal story into it. But we kind of got halfway through the book and we realized that we thought we had good policy ideas, but the big problem wasn't just policy, it was leadership. Do we have the right leadership to carry us forward? And so one of the reasons that's so important is that our institutions, or we argue in the book, our institutions are in decline. Certainly the confidence the American people have in our institutions, whether it's our schools, whether it's our military, whether it's our elected officials, whether it's our business leaders, are in decline. And so we need leadership to really turn around those institutions and bring them back to the principles that are required to anchor to really what makes America exceptional. That's the argument we make. But then we started to think about what is leadership? And despite, millions of books literally written about leadership, it's still a pretty amorphous concept. So what we tried to do is get to the 3 or 4 things that were most important in our minds for carrying the country forward. And there were 4 characteristics of leadership. The first was vision. And we talk a lot about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had a clarity of vision that was so important because if you have a vision that's a 2-page mission statement, it's very hard for people to align around that. But Reagan had the beauty of clarity of America's role in the world, clarity on the uniqueness and exceptionalism of America, and clarity on what it took to keep America in ascendance. And so that's really important. The second characteristic we talked about was courage. And of course, we have military people in the audience. We think about courage as charging the hill and all of that stuff. But there's courage that is very different or similar in some ways, but different, which is the courage to stand. The courage to stand tall in what you believe, the courage to fight against the consensus, the courage to stay true to the principles that you most believe in. And so we talk a lot about that in the book because part of the problem is just the groupthink that we see across our political spectrum. The third thing we talk about is humility. And humility is so important in leadership. I've learned this the hard way because you make a lot of mistakes when you're a leader. And if you don't have the humility to see the failure of your ways and learn from it, and the humility to know that you don't have all the answers and you can draw on others, you're going to be lost as a leader. And I talk about that in the book as someone who, when people describe my career, they describe it as like it looks like this. But in fact, it was more like this, including getting fired in a very public way as the CEO of Bridgewater. So I was the CEO when I first joined. I got fired a couple years into it by the founder, thought about leaving, decided to stay and take on another job, and then came back 5 years later and was the CEO for another 5 years. And that experience, which was so painful, also was a gift in terms of learning what it took to be successful as a leader and seeing some of the failures that I had had. So that's a really important thing, I think, in America today, because almost everyone's going to fail at some point or another. And it's not failure that's the problem. It's not learning from failure that's the problem. And then the final thing, which is so basic that it's almost seems odd to say it, but yet it's not apparent in leadership today, which is leadership's not about you. It's really not about you. It's about the people to whom you serve. It's about caring for others. And so we talk a lot about in the book about just simple things like in the military, leaders eat last. It seems like such a basic thing, but it's so absent in our society in many places where you see leaders. And that depth of caring is at the core of selfless leadership. And selfless leadership, in my view, is at the core of renewing America. And so that's why we spend so much time on it.
Well said. So I want to stick with the theme of leadership, but take us out into the world a bit. There are alternate models of leadership out there. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un. the theocrats in Iran. We do a lot of work at IRI all over the world, including mainly in the developing world. And there are voices in the developing world who say, you know what, you need a strong hand. All these democratic institutions, this big mess of citizen participation, we can create a different development model. This is Xi Jinping's actually fundamental premise. What's wrong with autocratic one-man leadership?
Well, I think at its core, I think we believe in America. We believe in our founding that government is conceived with the notion of supporting individual freedom and liberty. So the government works for us, the people. We don't work for it, and that's the difference between the two. And in our system, that doesn't mean you don't need strong, firm leadership. In fact, it's the very notion of the fact that our nations conceived for individual liberty that requires very strong, clear, visionary, and tough leadership to drive consensus, to find the path, to deal with conflicting points of view, to find the answer that's going to imperfectly take us forward. The alternative model, I think, is, among other things, unsustainable. Unsustainable in the sense that it's dependent on a single person. You know, the first thing you learn in leadership and running anything is you have to have the next generation be able to take you on. So the more you're dependent on one big force, one big personality, the more unsustainable your situation is. And second, that kind of top-down authoritarian model undermines the core of what makes a society vibrant, entrepreneurial, energetic, resilient, which is individuals being able to exercise their freedom and their rights. And so there's a bit of a contradiction, because I think at the core we should believe that the Chinese model is unsustainable. I think that's likely to be true. And simultaneously, it poses an existential risk at the moment because of the enormous threat that it poses in economic terms and national security terms. Those things can be true. We shouldn't take comfort from the fact that we think the Chinese model is unsustainable over time, because at the moment it poses a threat. And in fact, the fact that it's unsustainable may create instability in the future that would pose even greater risk.
Yeah. You ran a software business. You were CEO of several big software companies. You have come out of finance. When we look out at the strategic competition underway in the world, of course, there's a military component. You're a military man. I'm sure you'd like to see a Reagan-like defense buildup, but that's not enough. When we think about the global landscape, how to protect America, how to protect our freedom, how to stand with our allies, support a free and open world, could I draw you out a little bit on the technology and economic pieces of the competition?
I know that IRI is not particularly political or partisan. I mean, I'm a conservative, so I had a set of conservative principles that have governed how I thought about the role of government, small government, the role of individual freedom, the role of capitalism and markets. So those principles have sort of driven my career, driven how I think about life and service. But our moment has challenged some of my basic principles. Our moment has challenged, and we can talk about the different ways that I try to address that in the book. I think the rise of populism has been in part a byproduct of our system failing, a big part of our population. The American dream has not been available for millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans. And so I think that should be a moment for reflecting on some of the shortcomings, and I try to do that in the book. But it's also put us in a situation where China has a techno-authoritarian model that's winning. Let me just say that again, it's winning. China has a plan for technological leadership in the world, and we don't have a plan. And if you needed any evidence of that, there was a Wall Street Journal piece, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago about an Australian think tank that just did a study. You may have seen this, Dan. 44 of the most critical technologies in the world, critical to economic dynamism, critical to national security, artificial intelligence, satellites, quantum science, the things you read about all the time. According to this nonpartisan think tank in Australia, 37 of those 44 technologies, China's in the lead. Okay, how could that be, and what are the implications? Well, I think some version of that's true. In other words, China has exercised and created real leadership with its model, and we have not been able to keep up with that. And that's despite the fact that we have such a dynamic entrepreneurial economy. And so I think it requires an assessment, and I try to do that in the book. And I ask the question of what we need to ensure that we have technological leadership. And I think at this moment, technology matters more to geopolitical strength, to geopolitics, to military capability than ever before. So when I was in the Commerce Department 25 years ago or 20 years ago, you could see that the economics and national security and technology, there was a confluence of those three things. They're one and the same today. The leader in artificial intelligence or quantum science is going to have a huge leadership economically and from a national security perspective. So what to do? And what I try to lay out here is a technology policy model that doubles down on investment in basic R&D, which were about half of what we were in the 1950s as a percent of GDP, but also offers a model for how the government should participate in trying to encourage investment, private sector investment in the technologies that matter most. And what I essentially say is we can't do the China model. We can't try to become China. That's a losing strategy. In my opinion, we can't become an industrial policy country, particularly one where we're trying to impose progressive policies on the private sector through government money, which is what the CHIPS Act did to some degree. So we need a model that's bringing private sector capital into these sectors. And among other things, I propose an innovation fund that essentially says if the government thinks that we need leadership in artificial intelligence, then the government invests side by side with private sector investors and potentially takes first loss and caps its upside. So you make that sector more attractive, but you don't have the government picking winners or losers, and you don't have all the risks that come with government involvement. It's a slippery slope, though, so we got to be really, really, really careful. And that's a very antithetical view to where I would have started as a conservative, because I don't like the idea of government playing any role, but I'm also trying to confront the reality of our moment. And when you shed yourself of ideology and just say, how do we solve the problem? Kind of new ideas come to the surface. And because of that, I have a section in the book that said, what would Milton Friedman say? And Milton Friedman would certainly disagree with this argument. I would have disagreed with this argument 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But then my response to that is in essence, Milton doesn't have a good answer for our current situation. We can't lose this battle against a techno-authoritarian nation for leadership in the things that matter most to the future of the world. We can't lose that. So we need to be creative about ways to win it.
You also are a student of history. Our country has faced dangerous adversaries in the world before. We've also had flailing moments of weak and lackluster international leadership. Think about the late 60s and the controversies around Vietnam, the late 70s, you mentioned some of the Carter foreign policy debacles. Even after we and our allies won World War II, we suddenly woke up to the menace of the fact that the Soviet Empire occupied literally almost all of Eurasia. Obviously, we had a terrible civil war in the 19th century. We have come through these moments by renewing, as you argued in your introduction, by essentially recreating the toolkit for our leadership and success. But can I just draw you out a little more on sort of what history lessons you have learned that are appropriate as we look ahead at the next decade in foreign policy?
Well, I think the intersection of what we think when we sit in rooms like this, what we think America's role in the world should be and where it should go, and politics, and what actually people that vote or that live in rural Pennsylvania or rural Illinois or wherever it is, what they think. We need to be mindful of both. We need to be mindful of both. And that was the thing, running for office was, an experience of a lifetime. And it was really incredible. And I had spent 35 of my 57 years, something like that, in Pennsylvania. But I had also lived in Washington and New York. And, I had a career that had taken me around a bit. And the thing that I couldn't get over was the anger. When I was on the campaign trail, I could not get over the anger. And I knew the facts, but I didn't understand the emotion. And essentially what I learned, or what I saw reinforced, was that America hasn't been working well for many millions of Americans. And that explains, at least in my opinion, President Trump's election in 2016. It explains why so many people think the country's heading in the wrong direction. Just think about it. In the last 2 decades, if you had assets, any assets, you got a lot richer, right? You got a lot richer. You didn't have to be smart, by the way. All the people that said that they were so smart, so they made money, everybody made money in the last decade in particular because all assets went up. But only about 10% of Americans have assets. The large majority of people don't have assets. 75% of Americans live month to month, right? And if you think about inflation, well, inflation is difficult for all of us. It's really difficult if you're living month to month or if you're on a fixed income. And if gas prices go up, that's a pain. We all hate paying $5 at the tank. But if you can't afford to fill your pickup truck to get to work, it's a big deal, right? And 20 years of war was a huge burden on America, but it was a real burden on those rural communities that disproportionately sent young men and women to war, and then they're now dealing with the consequences, PTSD and all those things back in their communities. And the fentanyl crisis, which we all hear about and talk about, is under 100,000 people last year, 5,000 in Pennsylvania. So that anger, my big takeaway is that anger is grounded in reality. Like, they have a right to be angry. The system's not keeping up. The American dream's not available to them. And this affects foreign policy in really meaningful ways because they start to say, wait a second. The promise of America, and the promises of America has always been, if you work hard and play by the rules, that you can have a better life. Your kids are going to be better off than you are. If that's not working, then everything starts to be questioned. Everything starts to be questioned. And that's, I think, what's happening. And so what I try to do in the book is say, hey, those are legitimate frustrations and anger. We need to have policies that address that. And the threat of China that they feel in their communities, they felt it mostly economically because jobs have gone overseas and so forth. That's a legitimate thing. We have to deal with that. And this, I think, informs the debate around America's role in the world. So Ukraine is a good example of where this debate is playing out. And my view on this is that Ukraine is of great significance to the interest of the United States, that we need to play a great leadership role in supporting Ukraine. But I want to follow that sentence with, I understand the other side of the argument, because they see what appears to be endless commitment over 2 decades. They see corruption. They see our military supplies being taken out in grocery carts of Bagram Air Force Base. They see the kids in their communities coming home and they say, wait a second, that didn't work out so well. And so that's a long answer, I'm sorry, but I think it's one that has to, so our role in the world and how we use military power abroad needs to be in pursuit of national interest, and it also needs to be reflective of the reality of what Americans have experienced in the past and will experience in the future.
Of course. Okay, last question from me, and then we'll open it up to all of you. We have microphones, so you can just come up to a mic to ask Dave McCormick your question. But just to get us to that place for the next few minutes, Dave, let's say someone reads your book and agrees with every policy prescription in it. What do we need to do to get the American political system, our political leaders, to actually run this ball down the field, right? You mentioned polarization, division, anger. I mean, just to give one example, I was once at an event with Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from my state of Virginia, who said, you know what, if every time a US politician did a town hall and someone asked them in the town hall, name one initiative you're working on with the other party, that would actually possibly produce a different kind of politics in our country. But what ideas do you have for fixing our broken system, if I can just be really blunt and simplistic about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big, it's like, how do you eat that elephant? I think it's just one bite at a time. So I don't think any single idea is going to make a difference. But I do think the fact that the majority of Americans, for different reasons, feel like things are headed in the wrong direction offers opportunity. It offers opportunity. And the thing that James and I try to highlight in the book is one of the things that's happened, and the basis for polarization is that we have less and less commonality of experience. We have less things that bring us together. And one of my criticisms in the book is part of it's our education system. I don't think we're teaching an accurate view of America's role in the world, American exceptionalism, what that means. But by the way, with all the black marks too, but one that really shows the unique role America has played and what it's grounded in. But we also don't have common experiences that bring us together. And so we talk a lot about the military, not because we think everybody should be in the military, but the military is interesting because in 1950, 80% of the members of Congress had served in the military. Today, it's 17%. So you don't have that commonality of experience. And when you add on top of that the politicization of our institutions, the polarization that comes from social media, there's all these forces pulling us apart. So I've been a public advocate of national service. Now, I know national service is kind of a loaded topic because people fear, I think quite rightly, that will become a political program. But if you could find ways just imagine if everybody, just to do a thought experiment, everybody had to do 12 months or 24 months of common experience. It could be through the military, it could be through faith-based organizations, it could be through nonprofits, but the whole idea, doing something for bigger than yourself, doing something in pursuit of a common goal, a common mission. And that was, from my time in the military, the thing that I remember most is I remember my platoon in the late 80s in the 82nd Airborne Division. I had a guy from Alabama, a white guy from Alabama, a black guy from Newark, a Puerto Rican platoon sergeant who was 35 and seemed he was ancient when I was 22. I don't remember what any of them were. I don't know if it was Democrats or Republicans. I don't remember any of that. I don't even know. I don't think I ever knew. They were just part of something. We were part of something bigger than ourselves, serving the country, trying to take care of each other. We don't have that in our society today. So I think the answer, or part of the answer, lies in that, of creating commonality. It's a lot harder to make someone your enemy. It's a lot harder to speak of someone in flippant terms when you actually understand where that person's coming from outside the context of politics. So I think there's something there, and that's there's this great line from William F. Buckley that's in his book Gratitude. If you haven't read this book, read this book, Gratitude. It's about citizenship, and it says citizenship is both a privilege to be part of the greatest country in the world. It's also a responsibility to do what you must do to preserve it. And we've lost that. We're long on privilege. People get the privilege part. We've lost the responsibility part. It only is going to work if we all do our part, if we keep it working. So I think the answer lies somewhere in there.
That's great. That's great. Sign me up. I'm ready to go. 12 or 24 months. Anything you want me to do. Okay. We have a lot of virtual participants who can put a question in the chat, and Taylor will read out your question to us. So we would like to include everybody who's zooming into this meeting. We got a full room, and we got 2 empty microphones. So we'd love to hear from any of you so that I'm not running a monologue up here. Antonia, take it away. Thank you. Just go up to the mic if you want to ask a question. We'll just create little cues.
Can you all hear me? Mr. McCormick, thank you so much for being here. I want to ask a bit more about leadership and the military and service. We are a service-oriented organization here. We're a nonprofit. We are committed to the cause of democracy and around the world. Do you think there's a way that maybe there could be sort of a hybrid where we bring together sort of the military and sort of what we do to maybe create sort of a better diaspora for the cause of freedom around the world? And by extension, which goes to what Dan was sort of asking, as a way to try and, because I do think, sorry, I'm a little all over the place. When I talk to military friends, may not be serving now, but they have a commitment to country at just an incredible level. And that commitment, we could create certain partnerships in terms of what we're trying to do, say just us as an institute, there could be a real way to bring in veterans and really help them, but also instill some of these values that we care about here in IRI across the country as well. Just want you to react to that.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. First, I think it's a great idea and concept. I'm very wary of the active duty military getting drawn. In fact, I think it's a criticism in the way we lay in the book that the mission of warfighting is a more significant mission today than ever. And so I think anything that's distracting from that, and I know there may be some who disagree, anything that's distracting from that I think is really problematic at this moment. But our veterans community is a huge asset. And I think we've only begun to touch the surface. And the people that serve, they're purpose-driven. They've got all the gifts that came with serving in the military. There's huge opportunity. And there's places like Team Rubicon and others, which you may be familiar with, where the military has worked side by side with civilian disaster relief organizations and so forth. So I think it's an untapped asset. There's huge opportunity. And, part of it is tapping into that community and creating some certainty about what the path is for continued service. But I think it's a great asset.
Thank you very much. I like how no
Okay,
one
can you just go to the mic, please?
Tall Mike. I'm Musakur. I'm the Vice President of the Cambodia National Rescue Party. It is a great honor and pleasure to lead the Cambodia National Rescue Party with me today. I have colleagues from here. Always a pleasure, a privilege to come back to III. We had the honor and the privilege of knowing Mr. Craner. His passion, his patience as well, his understanding of a country, a people, a nation that fights for democracy. We are the opposition in Cambodia, not a small opposition, a big winning opposition, but we are in exile. So it tells you where Cambodia is. And Daniel Twining, thank you to your father. We will never forget Ambassador Twining during UNTAC years. My question is, I go back to the Vietnam War. My question relates pretty much to what you already said. But specifically, during the Vietnam War, Cambodia was a sideshow, right? And now, I'm afraid Cambodia is another sideshow. But we're talking about millions and millions of Cambodians and who are fighting, continue to fight. We don't want to be a sideshow. And we are not the only people who consider ourselves a sideshow of America. If you were to say, what should Democrats, people who fight for democracy in Cambodia, Democrats in Cambodia, should say, send a strong message to the US leadership, whether it is Republican or Democrats, doesn't matter. USA, that we consider as the power, the symbol of democracy and human rights and freedom and justice. What's the message that we should say to the leadership of America so that we don't continue to be just a sideshow? Thank you.
I'm going to use Dan's expertise here in a minute, but I mean, for me, one of the things that I had always took great pride in was when I was in the government and I went around the world representing the United States, that I could say that we're a country, imperfect as we are, that is deeply committed to these principles of individual freedom, and that's what America is grounded on, and that we strive, and I say this with humility, strive to be a true role model for the world in terms of our democracy, in terms of our individual freedom and liberty, and that we're on an imperfect journey, and that we're also a country that embraces its past, including those things that were failures in pursuit of a more perfect union. And I think that's the best thing that we can do is live true to our principles. Our Constitution set the example, again with humility, for liberty and freedom in the world. I honestly won't comment on Cambodia because I can't do so with any expertise, and I wouldn't want to pretend I could.
Lorne Craner was a great friend of Cambodia. It's great to have you all here. Cambodia, Dave, you will be interested in it. It's a good case study. a dictator there named Hun Sen, who has ruled. He's one of the longest serving dictators in the world. He was, well, not to go into the deep history of Cambodia, but he does not have a democratic pedigree. He had polling information before the last elections that the opposition would win the election quite decisively. So he outlawed the opposition and put the leadership of the opposition political parties in prison, which got him, 125 seats out of 125 seats. So he's, but it's also a case where, because there is not democracy, accountability, transparency, citizen participation in government, Chinese interests have taken over much of the country. There are very corrupt dealings between a dictatorial government and a big foreign power. Most Cambodians would love a big change and something very different. So it's great to have you all here. It's a reminder of the work that we do all over the world, which is to empower voices like this. They don't want to be America. We have an imperfect democracy. Every country has its own model, culture, history. But everywhere in the world, people want agency, self-determination, self-governance. And they want leaders to be accountable to them. You said it, citizens don't work for the government, right? Governments work for the people. It's a very radical notion. And we still don't live in a world where it's universally true, but we sure would like it to be one day, because we know it produces all sorts of other great outcomes for development, prosperity, security, and dignity. Thank you. Okay, Taylor, virtual comment. Question.
First one, do you believe that congressional senatorial term limits would serve to refocus government on the needs of their constituents rather than the needs of the political party to which they are affiliated?
Yeah, I have an inclination towards term limits. So when I was on the campaign trail, I embraced the idea that if I was elected to the Senate, that I'd term limit myself. And there was a fair amount of controversy around that because it's not, it's not a universally believed view. And the counter argument that I heard when I said that was, well, I said 2 terms. And I said, well, at the end of 2 terms, you'd just be getting seniority. That's when you really can start to do the job. And I was like, geez, if it takes 12 years to be in a position where I could actually do the job, I don't want the job, right? That cannot be the right framework for thinking about this. So yes, I think the short answer is I do think that could be a constructive force. I think getting from here to there is not without a difficulty, but I think, good candidates running and winning with the notion that is their orientation. By the way, that's pretty consistent with what our founders had in mind, right? This wasn't supposed to be a career where you showed up when you were 25 and retired when you were 75 or 85. And that was the idea. That was not what our founders imagined. So I think term limits is a way to create a bit more discipline around that.
Great. Yes, sir.
I'll ask you a 2-part question. Since you boiled everything down to leadership, and so we need a leadership, are you interested in running for president in the future? And since you praised Ronald Reagan, I was never a fan of Ronald Reagan, but he succeeded. He was able to bluff the Soviet Union, and suddenly the evil empire became his friend because he found that the Soviet Union was falling apart. And in my opinion, it was Gorbachev who really made the deal with Ronald Reagan, except the promises that were made haven't been fulfilled. And that's why we see today's relationship with Russia and United States. Given that, either if you're going to be a leadership, either you're going to be Ronald Reagan, or are you writing a book of American Gorbachev who said superpower in peril, a battle plan to renew Soviet Union?
Well, so I just ran for the Senate and lost the Senate primary by 900 votes. So I was, I was previously a CEO. So what's happened since that is I've finished the book, but I'm realizing when I'm a CEO, you have people that are working for you and with you, and you're giving advice and counsel and making decisions. Well, now I don't have anybody I'm responsible for. And so I've taken to giving advice to my 6 daughters on boyfriends and a variety of things. And my wife, who I've now started to give her career advice and things like that. Though the other day, she looked at me across the lunch table and said, you must get a job. She was not thinking president, by the way. That was not what she had in mind. So I'm trying to figure out, I started writing the book because the sentiment was the country is headed in the wrong direction. And if I could be a constructive voice and contribute in that way, then I wanted to do that. And then Pat Toomey, who was our senator from Pennsylvania, said he wasn't going to run again after I'd started writing the book. And my wife and I decided that would be a good way to try to be a constructive leader and a force. And I thought if I could win, that I could have a platform to talk about these ideas and push the country forward. And unfortunately, I lost. So now I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do again, whether I'll run for office or try to serve in other ways. And it's not obvious what the right answer is. I'm thinking hard about it because, as I said, you've got to have good ideas, whether these are good ideas or other good ideas. You have to have then good candidates who can win elections, and winning elections these days is hard. So we're trying to figure out the best way to do it. In terms of Ronald Reagan, what was interesting to me, I was just at the Reagan Library. I did a book event there, and I went into the Oval Office, the Ronald Reagan Oval Office, and there was one former president's portrait on the wall. It was Andrew Jackson, and I thought that was interesting because Andrew Jackson was a populist. And what Ronald Reagan did, which I think is hopefully what we can do today, is he was able to, as Republicans, he was able to bring blue-collar Democrats. He was able to get working class Republicans, and he was able to build a coalition that could not only win elections, but then drive policy changes. And we're reminded, we were just talking about this earlier, that Reagan governed as president with a strong majority of Democrats in the House. He was able to find that crack where he could drive an agenda that would bring America together and ultimately lead to greater prosperity and so forth. I'm hoping that such a moment exists today. Different leaders, different policies, but an opportunity, and I'll try to contribute and be part of that in some way.
I must say, Dave, I so appreciate that you're in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt would have put it, right? It's very easy, I think, to decouple from political life and just say, this is all very messy and chaotic, and I'm going to go, live on a farm or buy a yacht or just tune out. What do you say? Last question from me. Last question from me, and then we'll go to Ryan. What do you say to young people who don't want to get engaged in political life, who say there's nothing in this for me, no one hears me? How do you motivate people to participate?
Well, it's a real challenge, and we talked about this as a family, and if you can't do two things at the same time, you can't say you're terribly worried about the future of the country. Oh my goodness, everything's going wrong, and it's not what we hoped it would be, it's not what we imagined it would be, and then say, but I'm not going to do anything. You can't, and those of us, so there's two ways to look at there's those of us that are our age who have been the incredible beneficiaries of America, and we talk to our kids about it, and so if not us, then whom? Who's going to do it? Because in the overall scheme of things, we don't have that much to lose. Somebody says mean things about you, you lose an election. In the overall scheme of things, this is not like if we don't do something, then who will? But if you're a young person, you cannot get yourself convinced that it's just a flywheel. Things are just going to continue as they are. That's not the way history works. Great nations decline and fail, and we will be the exception if we're able to continue to renew ourselves. But you can only renew yourself if you actually act and lead. So I think the starting point is understanding the stakes are pretty high. And that there's a great line from Ernest Hemingway which says, bankruptcy happens slowly then quickly. And essentially it looks like you struggle and then you fall off a cliff. And so it's hard to recover it. It's hard to get America back when it falls off a cliff. And so the time to act now.
Thank you. Ryan.
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you for being here. My name is Ryan Gibson. I'm the security manager for IRI. You mentioned very briefly, kind of the polarization we're experiencing in the country right now. And then what resonated with me when you were speaking was your experience in the military, speaking about how, the gentlemen to the left and right of you didn't know what their political ideologies necessarily were. You knew they were here for the mission, here for the country. that kind of esprit de corps. I can say that my experiences, it was very much, in my military experiences, very much mirrored what you had stated. So my question is very brief. Is there a way that you see that we can, whether it's IRI, the veteran community, or the American population at large, is there a way that we can try to translate that culture or apply that mindset, to the country at large and translate it from that what's very clearly present in the military?
Not other than what I said, which is I don't think it has to be military, but I do think just the basic concept. What is service? Service is something bigger than you. Service is doing something for others. I think that concept of creating institutions or a path for service, particularly early in the life of young adults, is an incredibly valuable starting point. I think that creates the foundation. Rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, urban, rural, like getting them all in the mix in a common set of experiences. It just doesn't exist today. And in fact, it's going the other way. The military has become a family business. Most people who serve in the military had parents that served in the military or close family members. And so I'm not saying, again, it's not saying the military, but a commonality of something bigger than yourself in pursuit of making America great. And one of the great, if you read Tocqueville and he talks about his journeys through America, the thing that he keeps coming back to is that there's these institutions that bring America together. And for lots of reasons, social media and political polarization and so forth, those institutions now play less and less a role in our lives. So we got to find a new way to have common bonds. And when two ships are side by side, if they have one rope between them, it's pretty unstable. But if you have lots of ropes, then that begins to create a connection. And we just don't have many ropes between us as Americans today, and we need to do so.
It's a great place to leave it, Dave. We're very proud of you. Lauren Craner would be very proud of you and your leadership. We're delighted to have the Craners and the Cambodians with us today, among many friends. Thank you for your service. Thanks for inspiring all of us. And I hope you all who are here will join us. Books are out front for sale, and Dave has agreed to spend a few minutes signing them. If you would like one, if you are online, you can order one. And I'm sure we can also figure out a way to have that signed. But Dave, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here.